Hello, I hope you're all doing well. I wanted to get us started today on our last major chapter of the year. Chapter 14 discusses the events of the Civil War. We'll start with section 1 today, the War of the Brothers. This conflict was truly a war of the brothers. We see many families divided over the issues that surrounded the Civil War and see families divided and fighting on both sides of this conflict. Also, we'll see a lot of friends divided over this conflict. When you think about the U.S. Army, these soldiers split into their various regions, and often we see best friends fighting across the field together. In section 1, we'll look at the causes of the war. We've already talked about some of those as we looked at many of the documents that had contributing factors to this conflict. So we'll look at some more causes and also comparisons between the two sides as they go into this conflict and their preparedness to fight. One of the first major causes, and that one that everyone seems to go to first when you think about the Civil War, was slavery. This was seen as a very important part of Southern culture and way of life. When you think of the South, that's typically, at this time especially, that the history of slavery there and that being an important part. But we also know that many in the North and many throughout the South opposed the practice of slavery and its expansion to the West. There's many groups we talked about, those that fell under anti-slavery, that many of them fell into that category. And we also know that there's many people within the South that did not practice slavery, but become tied to that whole idea that everybody supported it just because they lived in the South. We see that the Southern plantation owners often viewed slavery as a positive good. They felt that they were doing something good by providing shelter, clothing, food, a work source for the slaves that were under their care. They thought that they were doing a good thing for them by providing them that. So sometimes there was varied views on that issue. Also, there was prejudice and fear that if the slaves were released from their bondage, that there would be a problem with the job market. Many people worried that there'd be a flood of workers for the jobs and there would not be enough work for everyone, and that was a concern for many also. We see there's the idea of union versus independence. Do the states have the right to secede? We see that many of the states had the idea that they could control the federal government by saying that they would secede from the union if they did not get their way. And so this was a way to control the government. It had been used many times before, but had yet to happen. But we see this happening at the beginning of the Civil War. With the states' rights view, each state seeing themselves as an individual, parts of the whole, but they're keeping their individual identity. That's why this confederation worked, is that it was individual states, but kind of with a little bit of oversight above them, but mostly they wanted to be independent. Others believed that if you became a state, that under Article 6 of the Constitution, you had given up your right, that the Constitution was the supreme law of the land, and that was to be put above all things, and the federal government was the highest point. So this was a major point of debate. We also see economics being a major division in the country. So the North is focused in industry, manufacturing, along with agriculture, but the South their society is mostly based in the agriculture, in cotton, tobacco, rice, cash crops, not always things that they could use for a food source. And because they produced the raw materials, things that they needed to be changed into finished goods, they had to depend on outside importing of goods. And so because those goods come from other places, often they're imported into the South, there was the concern about tariffs. So the North likes having a high tariff that protected the U.S. industries from imports, as we've talked about before. But the South saw the high tariffs as a problem for their trade. It made their products very expensive, made things hard for them to get in. And that was a major dividing point, is the economies where the North is very based in, could be very self-sufficient, but the South needed a lot of outside help. There also is the issue of patriotism. We see both sides, soldiers fighting for different reasons. Everyone had their own reasons for fighting, and often it was a very hard decision. Taking, for example, was Robert E. Lee. He had risen to high place in the U.S. Army, but when the Civil War began, he had to choose: did he fight for the Union, lead the troops there, or return to Virginia, his home state, which had seceded from the Union, and fight on that side? And he chose to go to his state and to Virginia, and it did cause him a lot of difficulties during the war, and from his other commanding officers on the Union side. But we'll talk a lot more about him later on. We also see there is a major difference between causing war and going to war. These soldiers had not caused the war. They had not taken steps to cause the war, but they are being called upon to go and fight in this war. And so there was these issues that fed into why they were fighting, and this was very difficult in many cases for them to face off against those that they were so close to. All right, let's look at the comparison of the two regions as we're going in. When we look at their resources, population was definitely something that the North had in their that made them better in this case. So the North has 18.5 million people compared to the South with 5.5 million and 3.5 million slaves. So a total population of about 9 million people. The North continually has immigrants coming in during this time. So they have quite the comparison of workforce. Also, when we compare the enlistments, the North had an enlistment of about 2.7 million during the war, compared to the South having between 750,000 to 1.2 million. The records aren't really sure in that case. Agriculture is also a place where we see some disparity in their resources. We see that the North grows the wheat, corn, oats, livestock, has a lot of food products that was easy accessible, and the workforce to keep that moving. The South is more focused in the cash crops, cotton, tobacco. These are not things that you can eat to keep you going. They do have a large amount of livestock, and that was probably in the agricultural category where they most compared evenly with the North. Manufacturing is also where we'll see a major divide. The North has 5 times more factories than the South. To add to that, 10 times more workers and twice as many railroad miles as the South when the war is starting. And because of the number of people in the North, they are able to continue to operate despite the war. They did not have to stop all other industry to fight this war. They could focus on keeping the country going, keeping it fed, and adding to those railroad miles. And we'll continue to talk about changes that happened throughout the war also. Now, when you look at the leaders, this is where the South has the major advantage, especially in these early years. We'll see the North really struggling with lots of different generals leading different battles, changing from battle to battle. But the South is very consistent in that Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, John Mosby, and many others were some of the best military minds in the country at this time, leading the South. And we'll see how their leadership really keeps the South moving forward in this hard battle, despite a lot of odds against them. Now, when we look at the strategy of each side, we see that the North has to invade and fight an offensive war. Most of this war will be fought in the South. Very little of it gets into northern ground. But the North has to invade and fight on the offensive here. We have General Winfield Scott, back from the earlier conflicts like the Mexican War, who is going to propose the Anaconda Plan. So the first steps of this is to blockade the southern ports, to cut off supplies, and to capture the Mississippi River to divide the Confederacy. So we see that displayed here on the map. We'll see that the blockade set around here to all those major ports like Charleston and New Orleans. A movement up and down the Mississippi River here to split that off and cut off Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy. And once you have control of the Mississippi River, they were going to go across the heart of the South to divide. We'll see that later, the capture of Savannah and onward north with the plan to capture Richmond, which would be the new capital of the Confederacy, very close here to Washington, D.C., the Union capital. The Southern strategy in this case was to fight a defensive war. They had to outlast the North's will to fight. So because the war is brought to them, they are fighting for their homes, for their families, instead of just trying to the more loose idea of preserving the Union. They're really fighting to protect their homes, similar to how we see the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. They're fighting to protect that home and family, and it's not just a war off with no purpose. So the Southern people have something that they're fighting for, and so we'll see how this plays out throughout the 4 years of the war. So just some reminders as we finish up today. Please complete your weekly post on your class channel, and also be working on Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. There's a PowerPoint that goes with that I'm asking you to view to get some general introduction to the book, and then also to complete the Microsoft Forms activity that is part of that. So take a look at that. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Have a wonderful week, and hope to talk with you all soon.